Welcome back to Breaking Silence here on Asia One. I'm Craig Vermay. Two European governments have confronted painful chapters of their own history, acknowledging that countless mothers and children were failed by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. In both the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, governments have formally recognised the suffering caused by historic forced adoption practices that separated unmarried mothers from their babies, often through pressure, coercion, and overwhelming social stigma. For decades, many women were told they were unfit to raise their own children, persuaded that surrendering their babies was the only respectable path. Some never held their newborns. Others were taught to forget that they'd ever given birth. Their children grew up believing they had been abandoned, unaware of the circumstances that had torn their families apart. The consequences did not end with adoption papers being signed. They echoed through lifetimes, shaping identities, relationships, and generations of families who lived with unanswered questions and unimaginable loss. Now, many of those mothers are elderly. Many of those children are grandparents themselves. Some spent decades searching for one another. Others never had a chance. The passage of time has not eased the grief. Instead, it has deepened the understanding of what happened was not simply the result of personal decisions, but of systems that reinforced shame, silence, and discrimination. Governments, churches, hospitals, and welfare institutions all played roles in creating an environment where vulnerable women often had no real choice. The official apologies cannot rewrite history, nor can they restore the years that families lost together. They cannot replace first birthdays missed, school graduations unseen, or the simple comfort of growing up knowing where you belong. But they do represent something many survivors have sought for decades: acknowledgement. To hear a government say, "We were wrong," is more than symbolic. It is recognition that the burden of shame never belonged to the mothers or the children. It belonged to the systems that failed them. Around the world, more countries are confronting difficult truths about historical injustices that were once accepted as normal. These reckonings are uncomfortable because they challenge cherished ideas about institutions and expose the human cost of prejudice disguised as normality. They remind us that progress is measured not only in what societies achieve, but by their willingness to admit where they have failed. The courage shown by survivors who refuse to let these stories disappear has brought the issue into the open. Their voices transformed private pain into public accountability. While no apology can erase decades of heartbreak, it can ensure that future generations understand what happened, why it happened, and why it must never happen again. Sometimes justice begins not with a courtroom, but with a simple act of finally telling the truth.
Forced adoption was never just about paperwork or legal procedures. It reflected an era in which social expectations, religious beliefs, and institutional authority combined to leave many unmarried mothers with little genuine choice about their futures. Women were frequently isolated from their families, pressured by professionals, and made to believe that keeping their babies would condemn both mother and child to lives of shame. Many signed adoption papers while under enormous emotional distress. Others have maintained for decades that they never freely consented at all. He children who were adopted also carried lasting consequences, often growing up with limited knowledge of their biological families, medical histories, or personal identities. For many, the search for answers became a lifelong journey. These apologies are therefore about much more than history. They recognise that trauma can extend across generations, affecting not only those directly involved but also children, grandchildren and entire families. They also acknowledge that institutions have a responsibility to confront past failures honestly, even when those failures occurred decades ago. Many campaigners say the apologies are an important first step, but that genuine healing also requires practical support, including easier access to adoption records, counselling services, and assistance for families attempting to reconnect after years of separation. Recognition matters, but for many survivors, lasting justice will depend on what follows the words.
The apologies mark the end of one chapter, but not the end of the journey. Many survivors are now looking beyond expressions of regret towards meaningful action that helps families reconnect and support those still living with the emotional consequences of forced adoptions. Governments will be judged not only by what they have said, but by whether they make the records more accessible, provide long-term counselling and continue listening to those whose lives were shaped by these policies. As more countries re-examine difficult parts of their histories, these moments may encourage others to confront similar legacies with honesty and compassion. For thousands of mothers and children, acknowledgement has finally arrived. The hope now is that truth, accountability and practical support can help transform decades of silence into a future built on understanding rather than shame. There comes a point in every war when numbers become almost impossible to comprehend. 100 lives lost is heartbreaking. 1,000 is devastating. 1 million feels unimaginable. But now, after more than 4 years of relentless fighting, the war in Ukraine has crossed another grim threshold.